So are we going to count or is it just, I can't
Okay.
even do it. My arms don't.
4,
5. Oh, no, okay.
3, 2, 1. Tom Velasco, everybody.
Tucker Maile, everybody.
So good to be here.
After 2 weeks off.
Yeah,
I mean, sort of. I did last Wednesday night, but we didn't record the next day.
because you
Parent-teacher conference.
had to grade.
The grading was done by then. I
Yes.
just met with parents.
You had to you had to tell them the grades.
Yeah, well, they could read them.
Yeah.
But then we could. The point is to talk about their kids and how their kids are doing, and this is more because it's more than a letter, right?
Keep up the grading, Tom.
Yeah, I will.
We all
I will.
appreciate it. Hey, we've got a rundown of some good questions.
We got a lot of questions.
and we're going to.
We got 2 weeks worth of questions.
Yeah, we're going to do a little bit of a flyover today because we got 2 weeks worth of questions.
Yep.
And you are teaching for an hour and a half.
Correct.
Through the book of Revelation every Wednesday.
Yep. We might cut that back. Kind of a warning for people. There was at least talk of it. There was talk of adding worship and maybe kind of scaling back to an hour again.
Let us
so
know
it's a
your thoughts
possibility.
below. And would you like him to teach more or less? Let the
Well, I
people
mean, there's
decide.
also just the factor of it'd be nice to kind of have just a little bit
Yeah.
less. Yeah.
Yeah,
Anyway, possibly worship added.
Yes. So,
So
should we start with the questions?
yes, we should.
October 26th.
October 26th.
2022. Here's
Correct.
what the people are thinking about and asking. The people want to
Good.
know. Question number 1 coming from Mike. What's up, Mike? Why would God want the book of Revelation to be part of the Bible since it is so difficult to understand its true meaning?
So here's the thing. I think the bits that he wants us to understand are understandable. I think that's really what it comes down to. I think that's where there's lots of things that let me put it this way. There are a lot of things. When I say a lot of things, I mean an infinite number of things God doesn't want us to understand. At least not now. I mean, maybe someday, right? I mean, the scriptures tell us that when we die and go to heaven, right, or when we're resurrected to see the Lord, we will know as we are known. The point being that our knowledge will be full or complete.
Now we see in part.
Now we
Then
see in
will
part.
know him.
Then we will know Him fully. I still don't even think then we'll have infinite knowledge. We're not God, so there will always be things that we just don't know. And I don't remember exactly where this is at. I probably should have looked it up, but the scriptures tell us that the hidden things belong to the Lord our God, but the things which are revealed belong to us and to our children forevermore. The book of Revelation, I think, is a revelation. It's things being revealed. There's a lot that is meant to be understood. The problem isn't that it's hard to understand. The problem is that people have expectations that the book is not promising to give. So people are reading the book, and because they're kind of struck by the imagery, they're thinking that the book is telling them things about the future that the book is not guaranteeing that we're going to know or understand, right? It's instead giving us a lot of understanding about things, about the divine order of things that we don't just see in real life. So for instance, I've been teaching on the seals, right? So the removal of the seals, which enable us to see the throne room in heaven. And we get to learn things about the nature of the throne room, about God, about worship, about the Lamb and who the Lamb is and what he represents. And then the fact that he is worthy to remove these seals. And this is what we talked about Wednesday. In the removing of the seals, he's teaching us about things like, why do conquest? Why do war? Why does famine happen? And so we focused on that idea that God is sovereign and in control, and what he's asking us to do is to be patient. That is a revelation. That is him revealing truth to us. And of course, some of the prophecies, I think you could, we're going to look at things, I'm going to say, this is evident that I think we know the meaning of this. So in other words, the things which are hidden, we don't know, but the things which are revealed are known. So a different question might be, well, why does God hide things from us? And that is, there's lots of reasons. And we couldn't even know why all of it. You could think of it this way, though, just by analogy. Think of your children. Children ask questions all the time. And many of those questions are ones that you couldn't even begin to answer, not because you don't know the answer, but because you can't put it into language that will meet their experience. And then other times, children ask questions, and they're things that you could probably explain, but you don't want to, because they're just not old enough. They're not at that place where it's time for them to learn that. And so too for us, same thing. There are things that God is not revealing because it's not time. It's not, we're not mature enough perhaps, or maybe it's just not that season. And so because of that, the book of Revelation is going to have things that are hidden and obscure, things that we're not going to be able to figure out. But it's not just Revelation. All the books of the Bible have bits that are difficult to understand, right? I mean, just simply the doctrine of the Trinity, right? We have one God who is three distinct persons. That's not a simple concept to understand. The Bible affirms it, it teaches it, but we don't understand it. So it's not just the book of Revelation that's hard to understand. Gospel of John, which tells us that in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, right? Right there. How can you be with God and be God when there's only one God? Right? So
I think it's also just a quick reminder of the principle that difficult is not bad.
Correct. Or that it's not bad to not know. And
a lot of things in life are difficult by God's design.
One of my favorite movie quotes. You ever seen A League of Their Own?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's that bit where one of the girls on the baseball team, it's, the setting is, it's, I think, World War II. Men are off playing, or are off at war, and so they form these professional leagues with women players. Right. Tom Hanks is coaching one team, and this girl cries, and he's like, well, actually, I might be mixing a couple scenes because there's some great lines in that movie. I was about to say no crying in baseball.
Classic
but
line.
One of his players says, it's so hard. It's so hard. And he goes, I know. It's baseball. If it was easy, everybody'd be doing it.
Right.
And that's kind of the thing, is like life has hard things, and getting at the Bible and like reading and trying to like unlock the meanings, like that's hard often, but that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile or good.
Yeah. And Bible reading mirrors following Jesus, which is difficult and often hard to understand.
Yeah.
Is there symbolism in verse 5, holding a pair of scales? If so, then what is symbolized? On another note, good fruit. Thank you.
Thank you, DJ. That's nice. I appreciate that. Yes, there is
holding
symbolism. There is symbolism in verse 5. Just to kind of back people up, this is verse 5 of chapter 6, and it's speaking of the third seal. And so this is the rider on the horse. Is it the black rider? I think it's, the red, I forget which color. Dang it. I'd have to pull out my Bible, but it's the third rider. And the third rider is holding scales. And if you remember, the third rider represents famine or a lack, right? So in other words, he's describing the fact, or I should say the opening of the seal describes the fact of reality. Part of God's judgment often is that famines will strike humanity where people do not have access to food. And that, of course, causes death and suffering and all those kinds of things. And so in this picture, he's carrying scales, and the idea with scales is you use scales to buy goods, right? So because you often would pay with gold or with silver or something like that, you have to weigh it out to see how much gold is going to, or how much gold you have, so that the person who is selling the item will get the requisite amount of gold. But you also have to weigh out the item itself, the item that you're selling, because you're selling it by a weighted measurement. And so if you recall, as the verse goes on, it says a quart of wheat for a denarius, or three quarters of a day's work. Yeah. And so it's like, what it's saying is it saying we have a very small measurement of wheat for a very large measurement of coin. And so the balances are just trying to say that the amount is going down. So that's what it symbolizes.
Cool. This would just really be in the category of fun fact. Did Winston Churchill coin the phrase, keep calm, carry on, a reference to that World War II mantra of whatever is happening, air raids and bombs and London's, the Blitzkrieg, they're just going to keep living their life, keep calm and carry on.
Yeah, which I brought that up, of course, in the teaching. I didn't, of course, know the answer to this, whether Winston Churchill coined it or not. So I did a little digging around. Turns out the phrase wasn't actually really used in World War II. It was a phrase that the Ministry of Information in England did put together, and they did put on posters, but they did that with a lot of different kind of phrases. And what they were trying to do is decide what would be the best kind of propaganda to put out to encourage people and get people kind of on board for the war. And so they did print up a lot of copies of it, but they never really circulated it, maybe a little bit, but it just didn't get nationwide circulation. So actually people didn't know about it. And it was actually something that we discovered, I think in the year 2000, like people found a bunch of old posters like this.
They're like, that's
and
cool.
Then it actually became
like, wow,
this saying, because people kind of looking back. So I actually kind of messed up in my teaching. Looking back on it, they actually we were inspired by the way, because these people did live that way, right? They actually did kind of keep calm and carry on.
Yeah.
So so the discovery of these posters kind of made it a phrase that was meaningful to us, and kind of looking to them with a degree of respect and honor. Now, I will say, as I was looking into it, I also saw that Churchill did in fact write like a letter that he kind of circulated around to the people, where he was kind of encouraging them. And in that, he does say two things, but he doesn't say them right together. The first one is stand firm, and the second one is and carry on your business. And so those two are kind of like that, which is why a lot of people do actually credit Winston Churchill with saying
We could do a whole sidebar episode on misquoted movie quotes, because this is very common.
Yeah,
that
people, like Play It Again Sam.
Yeah, Play It Again Sam, and all these ways that things become famous that are actually a misrepresentation of the thing they're actually quoting.
By the way, it happens in the Bible too, right? Like the lion shall lie down with the lamb,
which is not in the Bible. Yeah,
it never says that. It says the lion shall lie down with the wolf.
Right.
Right. So it's kind of it's funny how there's a term for those things. Is it the Mandela effect?
The Mandela effect is slightly different. I think that's a conspiracy theory that somehow history is being rewritten before our eyes, and text is being changed. So older copies will look different than newer copies. The Berenstain Bears, as a famous example, or Berenstein Bears. And people are like, from my childhood, I think it was Berenstein, and now it's Berenstein.
Is that the Mandela effect?
Yes.
I thought the Mandela effect had something to do with people thinking Nelson Mandela was somewhere when he wasn't. And then we put
of course, the name itself, I don't know how it is tied to the Mandela effect, but I often hear people thinking that history was one way.
Yeah.
And then doing a review of it and seeing it's a different way, kind of that.
Yeah, that's how what I thought it was. But that's kind of like that.
Yeah, it is.
So
sidebar episode. Comment below if you want to see Tom top 10 misquoted movies and top 10 Mandela effect conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
I'll go with the misquoted movies.
Okay.
So if more people buy cars, will it help the recession? Give us some context to this point of the teaching.
Okay, so I brought up, and I can't remember why. Do you remember why? This was 2 weeks ago. I did bring up the fact that inflation, right? We have these inflationary
it's basically
prices.
This chain that will essentially, if people aren't buying things, then companies aren't selling things, and then people will eventually get laid off, because it was just this kind of chain of recession.
Why I brought it up, though.
Because you were talking about the different ways that this is common in war.
Gotcha.
That as conquest happens, as conquering happens.
Oh, yeah, I was talking about just the events. Like
just different events. You're going to have death.
Yep.
You're going to have disease because people are living in filth.
Yep. And
you're going to have famine. You're going to have inflation.
Yep.
And part of this is recession because, so
that's actually kind of a really interesting thing, which for anybody who's watching what's going on economically, we're in this really precarious position. The precarious position is that we have really bad inflation. And inflation, the way you curb inflation, the way you bring inflation down is to cut spending. Like, you have to stop buying things so that you can bring the value of things down. That's kind of the idea. This is why currently the Fed keeps raising interest rates, right? They're raising interest rates because they're actually trying to dissuade spending. Meaning they're trying to convince people to stop buying houses. And the way they're doing that is you just put these massive interest rates. Like, I think right now to buy a house, you have a 7% interest rate, right? I refinanced my house at 3%. When I saw that I had a potential 3% interest rate, I immediately refinanced my house. Lots of people bought houses. Like, oh my gosh, 3%. I got to get locked in on that. So I got it fixed. I'm stuck at that. It's not going up again. But now the interest rate's 7%. So people are like, well, we're not going to buy because we don't want to spend that extra money. Like me, I'm looking at my car and I'm like, I really need to get a new car, but I'm not going to because interest rates are so high. So I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait till the interest rates go back down. So they're dissuading spending. And the idea behind that is that's going to lower the cost of things, because demand is going to go down. So supply and demand are kind of the two of the main factors. They're not the only ones, but that decide how much something costs. If you have a bigger supply, or the bigger the supply is, I should say, the lower the price is, and the more demand there is, the higher the price is, right? So it's like, this is working. So they're trying to cut demand, and with that, inflation should drop. But here's the problem. When you do that, you create recession. Because if people aren't spending, then what's happening to the economy? It's shrinking. So a recession is people are buying less stuff, which, if you think through all the consequences, if people are buying less stuff, that means less money is going to these companies, which means they have less money to pay people, which means people lose jobs, right? So the weird thing is that combating inflation means creating recession. And creating recession means preventing recession means creating inflation, right? So, for example, when COVID hit, Donald Trump, President Trump and Congress, they did the opposite of what's happening right now because they recognized with people not working and with everybody kind of going into their houses that they needed to keep the economy up and floating. So how do you do that? You do that by dumping money into the economy. So they did things like giving every American $1,200, or they did things like giving the loans to all the businesses, the PPP loans, is that what they were called? Mm-hmm. So they're putting money into the system, but they also did things to stimulate spending. So Donald Trump dropped the interest rates. Well, not Trump, but the Fed. The Fed dropped, because the Fed has, a lot of influence from the presidents at the time. They dropped the interest rates down to 0. That's why I was able to refinance my house at 3%, because they're trying to create spending. So you drop interest rates, so more people will spend. But what does that do? It inflates the economy. So the answer is yes. If people buy cars, then it will slow down recession, because the more you buy stuff, recession slows down. But the problem is the more you buy stuff, especially right now, inflation goes up. So it's like one of those things where you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, because both results are bad.
And that's why it's always cyclical, because you really don't have one without the other. Over a period of time, you will have hopefully a blend of a little bit of both.
Yep. And that keeping that balance is so important. By the way, interestingly, these things also kind of work contrary if you consider the interest of the individual versus the interest of the whole. Generally speaking, what helps an economy is you buying things. But what helps you might be not buying things, saving things. You see what I'm saying? So if all of a sudden everybody's like, oh, we're going to be wise and not buy foolishly, right? Americans buy foolishly. We buy so much stuff that we don't need. And that helps build economy. But if we were trying to be wise and say, maybe I shouldn't spend so much money, that would shrink the economy, which would then hurt everything. It's an interesting conundrum.
Back to question 1, I suppose, why it's so difficult to understand the book of Revelation, because life itself is difficult to understand.
Correct.
And economies are hard to understand, and countries, and all of this, geopolitical map. This name, are you familiar with this name?
So I'm not, but the person who sent in this question, Jose.
Yes.
Jose Medina, thank you for sending the question. He came up and talked to me about it, so I think I can give an answer.
Okay, what do you got?
So the question is Yanuka Rav Shlomo Yehuda the Antichrist? So I don't know who that is. I mean, aside from what he told me, I feel bad. I didn't actually look the guy up. He's, from my understanding, an Orthodox Jew who has developed a big following, essentially. And so I don't know who the individual is. I haven't really looked into him. But Jose came and asked if I thought he could be the Antichrist. And here's what I would say to this. The reason why he says that is the guy who is young, he's apparently an expert in the law, in the Torah, and he's developing a following. A lot of people really, really like him. And so it leads to a lot of Jews thinking he's the Messiah. And so then the question is if you have Jews starting to think an individual is the Messiah, does that mean that person could potentially be the Antichrist? I'm going to go into more teaching on what I think about the concept of the Antichrist when we get to it in Revelation. I haven't really talked extensively about it, but I do think that it's perfectly reasonable to think that the Antichrist would be a person who is thought by many Jews to be the Christ, right? To be the Messiah. That would actually make sense, right? I mean, assuming that the Antichrist is a person that is coming and pretending to be Christ, pretending to be the Messiah, then it would stand to reason that Jews would proclaim him such, right? However, I'm not inclined to think that just because there are Jews proclaiming a certain guy a Messiah, that means he's going to be an Antichrist or the Antichrist. Because if you know anything about Jewish history, you know that you have little pockets of Jewish communities that frequently identify people as the Messiah or as the Christ. Like, that's actually something that has happened repeatedly. When I say repeatedly, I'm talking thousands and thousands of times. Not sometimes. Like, it happens often. You get a community of Jews, they really respect their rabbi. That rabbi develops a following, and people start to wonder, is this rabbi nowadays it's typically a rabbi, but you go back to 70 AD, right? I've talked a lot about the destruction of the temple. I haven't gotten a lot into history of that. people were proclaiming themselves the Messiah when that war broke out. So there has long been a history of people claiming themselves to be the Messiah. And so coming down to this individual,
just another one.
It could just be another one of those guys. Now, could he? Sure. I mean, I don't know. Here's the thing. I could never know until something is done that makes it clear that he is. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I couldn't know. The Bible doesn't give us any code or something like that to unlock whether or not a particular individual is the Antichrist.
Why does the Lord's Prayer say, lead us not into temptation?
Okay, so I think when that question is asked basically based on the weird kind of wording, lead us not into temptation almost conveys with it the idea that God is leading us to be tempted.
Come over here.
Yeah. But really all the request is saying is it's essentially saying to God, please protect me from temptations and protect me from the evil one. So if you're thinking through the Lord's Prayer, right, it says, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. The idea being wherever evil, some translations of the Lord's Prayer say, deliver us from the evil one, which a lot of people argue that's the better translation. So what it's essentially saying is, Lord, give me protection from the temptations that my flesh, the world, or the devil will bring to me. So don't let me give way to temptation. Help me to overcome.
Amen. And a timely and important prayer.
Yeah, for sure.
Which denominations believe only 144,000 people go to heaven? And are they true Christians?
Yeah,
would we break bread with someone who says there will only be 144,000 believers in eternity?
Yeah, now just so you guys know, we've now switched to the November 2nd question. So these are the ones from yesterday.
Yes.
So I only know for sure one denomination that teaches that only the 144,000 go to heaven. And that denomination are Jehovah's Witnesses. They're Jehovah's Witnesses. And no, we do not recognize Jehovah's Witnesses as
brothers in Christ.
As brothers in Christ, as an authentic expression of Christianity, right? So we would not break bread with them. We would not consider them fellow Christians, nor they us, right? Like we are divided from Jehovah's Witnesses for a number of reasons, but the biggest one is they don't acknowledge the deity of Jesus. They don't acknowledge that he is God. Now, I do want to say really quickly, I've had, and I didn't have time to research into this. I've come across, when we talk about views like this, there are so many different views out there. Like I say it sometimes, but I don't think people can appreciate that. I don't mean that in a negative way, like people can't appreciate it. But what I mean is I don't think people are aware that the views even that I talk about are so, like, we're really narrowing this down to really broad swaths of Christianity. But if you really want to get down into it, there are tens of thousands of views of everything amongst Christians. And I know that I've encountered people who weren't Jehovah's Witnesses and who we might actually look at as Christians. I don't know, because it's like these vague recollections, who might say something like this. So I don't know all the denominations that might teach this. I just know famously that Jehovah's Witnesses do. And no, we do not recognize them as fellow Christians.
If you have not gotten a detailed teaching on this, last night gave a good explanation of where this comes from in the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
And I thought a much more clear answer than only 144,000 people go to heaven.
Yep.
So listen to last night's recording from November 2nd.
Yeah.
Does God put his will on the hearts of non-believers? Do they follow God's will, likely not knowing that their ideas are truly God's will on their hearts?
So, I think what this question is asking is, and so forgive me if I get this wrong, but it's essentially saying, does God in certain ways guide
puppet master
unbelievers in directions? And to that I would say yes, but it's hard to say for sure by the wording of this question to what degree you're asking, because the way that I would think of it, and this is something that is really important to understand, just as human beings, we have an enormous ability to kind of guide people in ways we want them to. I'll just give you an example. I remember playing chess with some friends of mine, and it's weird. We were playing team chess. So me and a friend of mine were playing against my friend's brother and another friend of mine. And I remember our opponents, one of them was a better chess player than the other. In my situation, I was the inferior chess player. And I remember as we were kind of going back and forth, we'd each take turns, like me and my teammate versus those two. We'd each take turns doing the move. And I remember there came a moment when my teammate turned to me and he said, watch this. And this was at a moment when the better opposing player had left, and the only one watching was his brother. And he walked over and he grabbed a chess piece and he moved it without removing his hand and kind of looked at it for a minute and then moved it back and then went and moved a completely different chess piece. He then walked back to me, and at that moment, his brother came over and grabbed a chess piece directly next to the one that he had moved and moved it to where we wanted him to move it. In other words, he knew his brother so well that by simply touching this chess piece near this one and feigning a move, he knew, maybe not with 100% accuracy, but he was pretty confident that his brother would make that move. And if you really think about it, we all do that all the time. Like when we're in arguments, we manipulate people sometimes. And our manipulations are all tapping into what we know about them and how they're going to respond. My point in this is that we have an enormous amount of ability to persuade people to do things and to guide people. That doesn't mean those people don't have freedom of will, right? Like all those people are still free. It's just that you can, through knowledge, kind of know a lot about a person. And that's what I think about God. Not that I think he's manipulating us, because I don't think that's true, but he is a person, right? Not a human being, but a person who is able to interact with us, and he is able to guide us. And sometimes in his guidances, not sometimes, I do think at the end of the day, he is sovereignly in control of the world. And so a plan is unfolding, and that plan is unfolding by him doing things and people responding. People with free will, people who can make their own decisions, but they are responding in ways that he knows they will respond. And so in that sense, yeah, I think he's guiding people, believers and non-believers alike. Do they know he's guiding them? No, not if they're non-believers, especially if they're atheists, because they're atheists, they don't believe God exists at all. So they certainly wouldn't know he's guiding them, right? But yeah, I do think that they could follow such a lead without knowing.
You referenced the story. Good answer, by the way.
Thank you.
I agree. You referenced the story where people left in droves, but then said that was a story for another day. Well, Tom, today's another day. Is today that day? What happened when people left in droves?
And this is a question asked by Cold Focus. I'd be interested. I am actually going to need more information from Cold Focus on this, or maybe you can help me. The time I remember talking about people leaving was from John 6:66. But I did explain that.
Now, I think this is in reference to a story where you were sharing and people stood up and left while you were speaking.
That story.
Yeah, not a story of the Bible, but a story where you were relating to.
Thank you for remembering.
Yeah.
When I read that, I thought, well, it's John 6:66.
It's a biblical story. But I think this was
tell this story.
This was a story where people left in droves,
Yeah.
and you were like, "Hey, I don't want to tell my personal story now."
Yeah,
but
I could tell this story. It's one that it's a tough one. It's a really tough one for me because this is one of the worst days of my life in ministry, and I really hate that I think of it as so negative in my life because what other people were going through was so much worse. It was a funeral. It was a funeral for somebody who it was the most tragic. Just the most tragic story. One of the most tragic stories I've ever been a part of. It was, I don't even want to go into detail in case like the parents of the lost one saw what I was. I just don't want to go into the details. It was a horribly tragic funeral, and it was tough because I was doing the funeral because the parents were believers who went to our church, but the person who died, their son, was not a believer. His wife was not a believer, and I have to admit, I was just really scared. I don't know how else to say it other than I wasn't scared about speaking the gospel to people who didn't know the gospel. It wasn't like I was embarrassed about being a Christian or talking about Jesus. I was very scared because I just didn't know the right thing to say. And I felt like I didn't understand what this guy's friends and loved ones would want. Like, what would be, in their minds, the best way for me to honor him, if that makes sense? Right? These are people who don't believe. He didn't believe. And I've done a lot of unbelieving funerals. So and incidentally, when I say that, I mean, I've done a lot of funerals for unbelievers. And I've always felt like like the Lord spoke to me and gave me kind of a way to comfort. This was one time when I don't know how else to describe it other than I didn't feel like I did. Like I just didn't know which way to go. And I gave a sermon, which, I mean, again, I feel really bad saying it, but I just felt like it was the worst sermon I'd ever given. Like, it's funny bringing up the Mandela effect, because I remember distinctly telling a story about Nelson Mandela. And I felt so stupid talking about it. Like, I know I had a point with it, but what happened is, as I was preaching, first his wife stood up and just walked out. And then after his wife stood up and walked out, one by one, everybody in the congregation just started getting up and walking out, except for the parents. Well, not even. The mom was so distraught she couldn't come, so just the father. And I don't want to say it was only the father who sat there, but probably half the group left. And that was a very overwhelming thing to watch. Like, it was like, and it made it so hard to move forward. Like, I was like, I mean, all I could think of the whole time was,
I'm failing these people.
That was what I was thinking. It was a really horrible experience. I think about it a lot.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, for Cold Focus, today's the day.
Yeah.
Shared that. And
thank you for clarifying that, because I was like, John 6:66. All I could think of is when the disciples left. Yeah.
Gib asked, do you think there's a reason Joseph is listed instead of Ephraim?
That's a good question. So this is referencing the list of the 144,000, the 12 tribes, which I commented on, that I don't know why Dan isn't included. And I would have to have the same answer here. I don't know why he mentioned Joseph instead of Ephraim. I interpret it as him equating Joseph and Ephraim, that they're the same, because Manasseh is included. And so since you have Manasseh and Joseph, I just have to assume that he's using Joseph as a term for Ephraim, which actually there's warrant to that. In the Old Testament, sometimes Joseph is used in the place of Ephraim or Manasseh. So it's not like it doesn't happen, but I don't know why they would have chosen that name specifically. It's that whole list is a mystery to me. I haven't come across answers that I found satisfying. By the way, that doesn't mean there aren't answers. I'm just saying I haven't found ones that for me were satisfying.
The search continues.
Yeah. When I have read things I have read generally try to say that there was something wrong with Dan or Ephraim. And there is. With those tribes, there is. But here's my big problem with, because these are the arguments I keep encountering, is all the tribes of Israel did bad things. And I brought up Benjamin yesterday at the end of the book of Judges, because specifically this thing, Benjamin was on the verge of being wiped out. And the conclusion by the 12 tribes of Israel and by God was, I can't lose a tribe. That was the conclusion. And so there's nowhere in the Bible ever where it says a tribe should be lost, ever. So given the reasoning at the end of Judges, I just have to think that any kind of an explanation by saying these guys are evil and therefore God wiped out that tribe or blotted out the name of a tribe just doesn't make sense to me. So that's my answer to that.
It's an answer that begs more time and more answers.
Yep.
Is the judgment referenced at the end of chapter 6? Will those unbelievers, atheists, agnostics, know this is God's judgment?
So there's two ways I think you could look at this. In the text, it sounds like, yes, they know it's God's judgment, right? They say the great wrath of God and of the Lamb is upon us. And it seems to me that in the final judgment, like that capital D, day of the Lord, like on that final judgment, everyone will know it is the day of the Lord. Now, as I pointed out, of course, the preterists think that is about the destruction of Jerusalem. So then the question is did the people in that day, if that was true, like if that's the accurate interpretation of that passage, would they all have known that it was God's judgment? Well, maybe not all, but certainly a lot. And let me just say this, even for an atheist or an agnostic, people who affirm repeatedly they do not believe in God, when the day of the Lord comes, I mean, like how I talked about it yesterday, those moments of judgment, most people can't help but think karma, or you know what I mean, or God's mad. Like they can't help but defer to this idea that there is a power out there that is mad at them.
Yeah.
And so do they know it's God in that small d day of the Lord? Maybe not. I mean, not like literally everybody, especially if they stubbornly hold to their atheism. But what I would point out is even the atheist, the most ardent atheist, when judgment comes upon him, if he ties it to his behavior, if he knows he done something wrong, then it's hard for him not to think that there's a power bringing it down upon him.
Absolutely.
You hear people say that kind of stuff all the time.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah.
Yep. Several times in Revelation and the other references made, it sounds like God chooses very certainly specific people or groups to be saved. Is this predestination?
So I'd probably need something a little bit more specific in terms of like what you're looking for there. Like I was thinking about people being saved. Most of the time it says that it just references groups of people without giving a causal explanation. Like even with the Jews, all we know about them is they're Jewish, and there's 144,000 of them. There's nothing laid out as to the why those guys in particular are saved. So I don't know that it needs to bring with it the idea of predestination. I mean, at least in everything that we've read thus far, it seems to me that there's very little else said other than that. Actually, I don't even think it says that they were righteous or anything like that in particular. I mean, you do have the reference to people who were martyred, who gave their lives, and thus, the people under the altar. But when it talks about the great multitude in chapter 6 or the 144,000, it never explains why God saved any specific one of those. The 144,000, I guess you could maybe look at it this way. Every tribe, there's 12,000. And so if God's literally like 12,000, well, he's got to pick 12,000 from each of these tribes. So there must be some kind of election that goes in that, or some kind of predestination. But I don't see a lot of connection between this and the doctrine of predestination. Now, I will say there are passages in the Bible that do imply aspects of predestination, right? I mean, you can see it, Romans 9, Ephesians chapter 1, all of that kind of stuff. And just, in general, Christianity of all flavors does teach that predestination happens. The debate is over what is the nature of predestination. That's where Christians disagree.
The foreknowledge aspect.
Yeah, so for instance, just bringing up, to make it, I don't like oversimplifying, but what people typically think of when they think of John Calvin versus Jacob Arminius, two Christian theologians, both of them, I think, true Christians who are worthwhile reading, right? Arminius, incidentally, was a student of Calvin, so they were actually, or at least, he was a student of Beza, which would have been Calvin's successor. So he was somebody who ultimately believed at one point in Calvin's doctrines and would have revered him and all that kind of stuff, but he came to a different conclusion. Calvin says that God predestines us independent of any choice that we have made, are making, or will make. So the predestination is rooted completely in God's decision-making process. Arminius also believes in predestination. He just believes that predestination is done based on God's foreknowledge, that God foreknows who's going to choose him, and thus he saves them. Even apart from that, if you just stop and consider for a second, if you just think about it, assuming that it is not the case that every person gets saved, meaning universalism, assuming that is not the case.
There will be some who are cast off.
There are going to be some who are cast off and who are condemned to hell. Assuming that's true, which the Bible teaches that, and Christians have always believed that, there must be some aspect of predestination.
Yeah.
So let me explain. God could have presumably decided to save everybody, right? Just allow everybody in. But he didn't. So by not choosing to save everybody, he now has made a predestinary choice. I'm going to save some and not others. And then he has to make a decision of the criteria by which he's going to base that on. Christians believe that salvation comes by faith, by God's grace through faith. By simply making the choice that he's going to save people by grace through faith, that is a kind of predestination. Because some people are going to make that choice and others aren't. And so he's chosen to save the people who did make that choice. He could have had a different set of criteria. He could have said, I'm going to save all blonde-haired people, or I'm going to save all Jewish people. And nobody else, right? I mean, that's actually how the Jews kind of thought in antiquity, is I'm just saving the Jews and everybody else is condemned. But the Christians are like, no, actually, salvation is bigger than that. It's not just the Jews. It's everybody who has faith in Christ. But it's still picking a group rather than, one group rather than another. Because God knows everything, the fact that he saves some and condemns others requires predestination of some kind. So it's not as if any Christian really just flatly rejects the idea of predestination. It's just we disagree on what predestination is.
Hope that helped. Final answer or final question?
Yeah.
You said that Jesus is fully man and fully God. Does he exist as a physical man today in some physical realm? Was he a spirit who became a man?
Okay, so Dusty and Melba, great question. I did say Jesus is fully man, fully God. That is the traditional doctrine of what people call the hypostatic union, right? It was confirmed at the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD, and it has been the doctrine that has been the established view of the church throughout history. I also do think that it's the doctrine that is most fully is supported by Scripture. Having said that, it's a tricky doctrine to understand. It's hard to really answer all the questions to it. And here's one thing: it's really hard, I think, to answer this particular question. But I'll do the best I can. He is a physical man with a physical body, still, because Jesus died and he resurrected, and this new physical, and his resurrection body was physical. Like, he could go and he could touch people, right? We saw that he touched him. He takes Thomas. He says, "Here, touch my side, touch my hands. Be no longer unbelieving, but believe." Mary hugs him and he says, "Don't grab onto me, Mary, because I have to go," right? So it's like, it's a physical body. But here's another thing: the physical body is very different from our physical bodies, right? So the disciples are all in a locked room, and all of a sudden Jesus appears there in the midst of them in his physical body. So it's a physical body that is very different from other physical bodies. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul explains a lot about this. So in 1 Corinthians 15, he's actually addressing Christians who say that Jesus did not resurrect from the dead, which sounds weird. These are people, now I'm not trying to say those people would have been truly born again, real Christians, but in Paul's day, you had people in the church professing to be Christians who said Jesus didn't actually resurrect from the dead, which is why in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul starts off by saying, what? Like, first of all, Paul says, he did raise from the dead, and he was seen by Mary and all the women who went to the tomb, and he was seen by Peter and by John and by all of the 12 apostles. And he goes on and he says he was even seen by over 500 people at once, and even I saw him last, Paul says. He was resurrected from the dead. And Paul goes on very interestingly, and he says, some of you might say, how then was he resurrected, or with what kind of body was he raised up? In other words, what was happening is these Greek thinkers, like these Greeks as they're starting to convert to Christianity, who are really influenced by Plato taught that the physical body was bad, and that it's our spirit is the only thing that matters, that we're like ghosts, right? And that what happens when we die is our spirit separates from our body and goes to heaven. That's what Plato taught, and that's what some of these Christians were believing. And Paul's saying, no, that's not true. So understand, when these Christians were saying that there's no resurrection, they weren't saying like somebody would say today. They didn't mean that when you die, you cease to exist. What they meant is when you die, your soul leaves your body, and your soul lives forever as a spirit. Paul goes, no, that's not true. Paul's saying there's a body. And they go, okay, Paul, if that's true, then what kind of a body is it? Because bodies deteriorate. And that's when Paul gives this beautiful analogy where he says, "O foolish one, do you not know that what you plant, right, is not the same body as what you reap?" So he says, what do you do when you plant something? You take a seed that is one kind of body. It's a seed. You put it in the ground, death. You cover it up with dirt, buried. And then what grows from that seed is a new body, body, right? It's a plant that grows up. It's physical, but it's different from the seed. Well, so too, he then goes on and says, well, how's the resurrection going to happen? And he says, Jesus was the first fruits, meaning Jesus is the first resurrected person. And he means that literally. Some people might say, well, there were cases of people being resurrected, like Elijah and Elisha raised a child from the dead. No. Those were people who were resurrected in their old bodies that were going to die again. Lazarus was resurrected in his old body. He died again later. That was not a new body. Jesus was the first to resurrect with the new body, which is going to be the kinds of body that we're going to have. Paul calls this new body a pneumatikos, which he contrasts with a psychikos, which literally hard to translate because these were words he created. Psychikos, he says, is this body, the human body that's going to deteriorate, grow old, and corrupt. The pneumatikos is going to be this new kind of spiritual body, but it's a body that is going to be totally different in the same way that a mustard tree, is different from a mustard seed. It's a totally different thing, but it's physical and it's real and it's tangible. So then, Jesus, resurrected body, real, physical, tangible, but different from the bodies we have. He could walk through walls. He could do things that normal human bodies can't. And when he's caught up into heaven, does he go to a place? Like, is he hanging out on the other side of Saturn? Now, in one sense, I don't know the answer to that because the Bible doesn't really tell me, but I think I know. And what I think is that Jesus is the first person who has ever passed into the heavenly dimension. The heavenly dimension is a place, but that heavenly dimension does not exist in the material universe, right? And so this is when I keep using the metaphor as we're going through Revelation, I talk about the removing of the veil, right? The removing of the veil is like symbolic language to speak of the fact that there is a heavenly realm that I do believe overlays and interlaps with the physical realm. The story I've told now, I think twice in this class, because I repeat stories, forgive me, is that story about Elisha and his servant, right? The one where the armies come and the armies of the Syrians come and surround him. And the servant's all stressed out. And Elisha's like, oh, Lord, open his eyes. And at that moment, he sees armies surrounding the Syrians. And those armies are angelic beings. Here's the thing. Those angels are there. There is a location. It's just a location which is veiled. That the material realm that we see is somehow separate and blocked from this spiritual realm that exists and is there. And in the bodies we have, we can't enter that spiritual realm. Paul speaks of a man, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. He does say that. So he wouldn't be able to answer this question exactly. But he says was caught up to the third heaven. What is that referencing? It's his spirit going into this other realm. That's what John's doing in Revelation. His spirit is going into this other realm. But Paul actually says, was it in my body? I don't know. Maybe it was. Right? He's like, I don't know. But so all this to say, Jesus has a physical body. And that physical body could go behind the veil and could go into that realm. Can this body? I don't know, but I don't think so. But maybe it could. It does, like Paul didn't know. But I can say this, it doesn't usually, not generally. So in that sense, yes, Jesus is in a location. And he does have a physical body, but that location, I do not believe, is in the material universe that we think of. In other words, we couldn't hypothetically get in a spaceship, and if we searched everywhere, find him out there. We'd have to find a way to go through the veil. And only God lets people go through the veil. So.
And this, I think, is a fantastic way to create a bookends of how we began and how we end. Because the book of Revelation is difficult because we're literally overlaying realms of reality.
Yep. Heaven and earth.
Heaven and earth coming together in this revelation. Yep. And this is exactly what you just described, which was beautiful, that there is a first fruit of the physical entering into the spiritual. Yep. And this is what Christians hope for. Yep. This is what we hope for. This is why when we go to Christian funerals, it's a much different experience than when we go to the funeral of just the physical being, the person who only hoped in the physical. Very difficult to celebrate with hope if you do not, by the grace of God, have faith in the spiritual dimension of reality where Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father.
Amen.
Amen.
Awesome.
Wow. Well, we missed you. We're so glad you're back.
Yeah,
you didn't miss a beat. You still have your fastball, which is so good.
Good. I don't want to lose that fastball. Don't need Tommy John surgery.
No, it's exactly right. Tune in every Wednesday night. It's live from Boise, Idaho in our little church sanctuary where Tom is teaching through the book of Revelation. And we gather questions from that night, answer them with you guys. And if you have questions that you don't get into our Slido, then you can ask them on YouTube. But thanks for tuning in. Yep. And always, Tom, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Very
good to see you.
Very good to see you.
All right.
See you later.